The morning sun had barely touched the sky when the buses rolled into the front gates of Naval Station Coronado. It was a Monday, the kind of Monday that changes lives forever. 37 new recruits sat inside those buses, their faces pressed against the dusty windows, their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. They had dreamed of this moment for months, some of them for years. They were finally here. They were finally at the place where ordinary men and women were supposed to become something extraordinary. But most of them had no idea what was really waiting for them on the other side of those gates. Among the recruits was a young man named Derek Holt. He was 23 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and built like someone who had spent every single day of the last 5 years inside a gym. His arms were thick with muscle. His jaw was square and hard. He had a tattoo of a wolf on his right forearm and another one of a skull on his left shoulder. He walked like he owned every room he entered. He talked like he had already won every fight he would ever face. Derek Holt was the kind of man who believed he was destined for greatness, not because he had earned it, but because he had always been told he was special. Back home in a small town in Texas, Derek had been the star of everything. He was the captain of the football team in high school. He won the state wrestling championship twice. He got into fights at bars on weekends and never lost. Or at least that is what he told everyone. His father was a retired Marine, and his older brother had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Derek grew up hearing war stories at the dinner table. He grew up believing that strength was the only thing that mattered in this world. He believed that the toughest man in the room was always the one in charge. And he believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was always going to be the toughest man in the room. When Derek signed up for the Navy, he did not just want to serve, he wanted to become a Navy SEAL. He wanted the trident pin. He wanted the respect. He wanted people to look at him and know, without a single word being spoken, that he was dangerous. He had trained hard for the opportunity. He ran 10 miles every morning. He did hundreds of push-ups and pull-ups every day. He swam in cold lakes and held his breath underwater until his lungs burned. He was physically ready. At least, that is what he believed. But physical strength was only one piece of the puzzle, and Derek did not understand the other pieces yet. He did not understand humility. He did not understand discipline. He did not understand that the most dangerous people in the world are often the ones you would never suspect. And that lack of understanding was going to cost him everything. The recruits were lined up in the courtyard within minutes of arriving. A senior chief petty officer stood in front of them, his face carved from years of sun salt and suffering. He did not smile. He did not welcome them. He simply looked at them the way a butcher looks at cattle and said that 80% of them would not make it through the first phase. He said that most of them would ring the bell and quit before the end of the second week. He said that the ones who survived would be changed forever, and not in the way they expected. Derek stood in that line with his chest puffed out and his chin held high. He looked around at the other recruits and felt a wave of confidence wash over him. Most of them looked scared. Some of them were skinny. A few of them were shaking. Derek smiled to himself. He thought this was going to be easy. He thought he was already better than everyone standing around him. That was when he first noticed her. She was standing about 10 spots down the line from him. She was not very tall, maybe 5'6" at the most. She had dark brown hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her face was calm, almost peaceful, like she was standing in a park instead of a military training facility. She was lean but not particularly muscular, at least not in the way that Derek measured strength. She did not have bulging arms or a thick neck. She did not look like she could bench press 300 pounds. She looked, to Derek, like someone who had wandered into the wrong place. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Mara Voss, but Derek did not know that yet. He did not know her name, her rank, or her history. He did not know that she had been a Navy SEAL for over 12 years. He did not know that she had completed some of the most dangerous missions in modern military history. He did not know that she had been deployed to 6 different countries, that she had led teams through firefights in places most people could not find on a map, that she had earned a Silver Star and 2 Bronze Stars for actions that were still classified. He did not know any of this because Mara Voss did not look like what Derek thought a hero was supposed to look like. Mara was at Coronado that week for a specific reason. She had been asked by the commanding officer to observe the new class of recruits and help evaluate their potential during the early stages of training. It was something that experienced operators did from time to time. They would blend in with the new arrivals, watch them closely, see how they behaved when they thought no one important was watching. It was a test within a test. The recruits were being evaluated not just on their physical abilities but on their character, their attitude, their ability to work with others, and their respect for the people around them. Mara had done this before. She knew how to fade into the background. She wore the same training gear as the recruits. She carried no insignia of her rank. She introduced herself simply as Mara when anyone asked. She did not talk about her past. She did not boast. She did not try to impress anyone. She just watched and listened. Derek noticed her during the first set of exercises that afternoon. The recruits were taken to the beach for a brutal session of running, crawling, and carrying heavy logs over their heads. It was designed to break them down quickly, to separate the ones who had heart from the ones who only had muscles. Derek powered through the exercises with raw aggression. He yelled and grunted and pushed the other recruits out of his way when they were too slow. He finished near the front of the pack every time and he made sure everyone knew it. Mara finished somewhere in the middle. She did not rush. She did not yell. She moved with a quiet efficiency that nobody paid attention to. She helped a struggling recruit carry his end of the log when his arms gave out. She kept a steady pace during the runs, never sprinting ahead but never falling behind either. She looked like she was barely trying, and to someone like Derek, that meant she was weak. After the session, the recruits gathered near the water station, pouring water over their heads and catching their breath. Derek was surrounded by a small group of other recruits who had already started looking up to him because of his size and his loud confidence. He was talking about how easy the exercises had been, how he could have done twice as much, how most of the people in the class were not going to last a week. Then he pointed at Mara, who was standing alone, drinking water quietly and stretching her legs. He said something to his group that made a few of them laugh nervously. He said she looked like she belonged in a yoga class, not a SEAL training program. He said he did not understand why they were letting people like her waste everyone's time. He said it loud enough for Mara to hear, though she gave no sign that she had. One of the other recruits, a younger man named Ellis, told Derek to keep it down. He said they did not know anything about her and it was better not to make enemies on the first day. Derek looked at Ellis with the kind of expression that a bully uses when someone dares to challenge him. He told Ellis to relax and said that he was just stating facts. He said that in the real world, size and strength were all that mattered, and anyone who did not have those things was just taking up space. Mara heard every word. She had been trained to hear whispers in the middle of a firefight. She could read lips from 50 meters away. She knew exactly what Derek was saying about her, and she filed it away in her mind without reacting. She had met hundreds of men like Derek in her career. Big, loud, confident on the outside, fragile on the inside. She knew that the training would either fix him or break him, and she was curious to see which one it would be. The first week continued, and Derek kept up his pattern of dominating the physical tests while alienating everyone around him. He was always the first to finish the runs, the first to complete the obstacle course, the first to volunteer for the hardest tasks. But he was also the first to complain when someone else slowed the team down. He was the first to insult the recruits who struggled. He was the first to refuse help from anyone, and the first to deny help to others. He treated the training like a competition against everyone else instead of a challenge they were all supposed to face together. The instructors noticed this. They always noticed. One of the senior instructors, a man named Chief Warrant Officer Braden, pulled Derek aside after a particularly ugly incident during a team exercise. Derek had screamed at a smaller recruit for dropping his end of a boat during a carry, calling him useless and weak in front of everyone. The smaller recruit, a 19-year-old kid named Parker, had looked like he wanted to disappear into the sand. Chief Braden told Derek that being strong was not the same as being good. He told him that the SEALs did not need men who could lift the heaviest weight. They needed men who could be trusted, men who could think clearly when everything was falling apart, men who could put the team above themselves. He told Derek that if he did not learn to control his ego, he was going to wash out, no matter how many push-ups he could do. Derek nodded and said yes, sir, and looked properly serious. But the moment Chief Braden walked away, Derek rolled his eyes and muttered under his breath that the old man did not know what he was talking about. He believed he was being singled out because the instructors were jealous of his abilities. He believed that the whole system was designed to hold back people like him, people who were naturally superior. Meanwhile, Mara continued to observe everything from her quiet position in the background. She saw how Derek treated Parker. She saw how he rolled his eyes after Chief Braden's talk. She saw how he mocked the other recruits behind their backs, and how he flexed in front of the mirrors in the barracks like he was posing for a magazine cover. She wrote detailed notes every night in a small notebook she kept in her bunk. She was building a complete picture of every recruit in the class, but Derek's picture was becoming the most detailed of all. By the end of the first week, the class had already lost 8 recruits. They had rung the bell and walked away, unable or unwilling to continue. Derek celebrated each departure like it was a personal victory. He said the weak were being weeded out. He said that soon only the real warriors would be left. He said this loudly in front of everyone, and each time he said it, Mara watched a few more recruits pull away from him, their respect turning into something colder. One evening, as the remaining recruits sat in the common area cleaning their gear, a quiet conversation started about why they had each joined. Some talked about wanting to serve their country. Some talked about wanting to challenge themselves. Some talked about family traditions and personal goals. When it came to Derek, he said he wanted to be the most feared man in any room. He said he wanted enemies to hear his name and run. He said he wanted the sealed trident because it was the ultimate proof of dominance. Nobody said anything for a long moment after that. Then Ellis, the recruit who had tried to quiet Derek on the first day, said something simple. He said that the best SEALs he had ever read about were the ones nobody ever heard of. He said the real operators did their job and disappeared. He said that fame and fear were not the point. Service was the point. Derek laughed at this. He called Ellis a dreamer and said that nice words did not stop bullets. Ellis did not argue. He just went back to cleaning his boots. But across the room, sitting in a corner with her own gear spread out in front of her, Mara allowed herself the smallest smile. She liked Ellis. She wrote a good note about him that night. The second week brought harder challenges. The runs were longer. The swims were colder. The sleep was shorter. The instructors pushed every recruit to their breaking point and then pushed them further. Derek continued to perform well physically, but the cracks in his character were becoming wider. He got into a shouting match with another recruit during a navigation exercise when their team got lost. He blamed everyone but himself. He threw his compass on the ground and said the equipment was broken, even though it was working perfectly fine. The instructors saw all of this. Mara saw all of this, and slowly the other recruits began to see it too. Derek was strong, yes. Derek was fast, yes. But Derek was also selfish, reckless, and incapable of admitting when he was wrong. These were not the qualities of a SEAL. These were the qualities of a liability. But Derek did not see himself that way. In his mind, he was the best recruit in the class. In his mind, everyone else was the problem. And in his mind, the quiet woman who kept finishing in the middle of the pack and helping other people instead of competing was the weakest link of all. He started making comments about Mara more frequently. He would say things under his breath when she walked past. He would make jokes about her size to the recruits who still listened to him, which was a shrinking number every day. He would watch her during exercises and shake his head, as if her very presence offended him. He never said these things to her face. He said them behind her back, to people who were too intimidated by his size to push back. Mara knew about every single comment. She had sources everywhere. Recruits who respected her quiet strength would come to her and tell her what Derek was saying. She thanked them each time and told them not to worry about it. She said that words only had power if you gave them power. And she had stopped giving power to words like Derek's a very long time ago. But she was also keeping a careful record of his behavior because it was her job, and because she knew that men like Derek did not just talk. Eventually, they acted. And when they acted, they usually acted in the worst possible way at the worst possible time. She had seen it before. She had seen it in combat zones where soldiers with more ego than sense made decisions that got people killed. She had seen it in training facilities, where recruits with more muscle than brains hurt other recruits because they could not control their temper. She had seen the damage that unchecked arrogance could cause, and she was determined to see it coming before it happened this time. The second week ended with another 4 recruits ringing the bell. The class was getting smaller. The survivors were getting tighter as a group, bonding through shared suffering the way soldiers always did. But Derek was not part of that bond. He was on the outside, surrounded by a wall of his own ego, unable to see that the thing he thought made him strong was actually the thing that was making him alone, and he had no idea that the quiet woman he kept dismissing was watching his every move, writing down his every word, and waiting patiently for the moment when his true character would reveal itself completely. That moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. It was coming in a place no one would have predicted. It was coming in the mess hall, on a Tuesday evening, over something as simple as a tray of food. And when it came, it would change Derek Holt's life forever, though not in the way he had always imagined. The third week began with a sense of heaviness that hung over the entire base. The remaining recruits could feel it in the air, that invisible pressure that comes when you know the worst is still ahead of you. The physical demands had increased again. Morning runs were now happening in full gear, carrying packs that weighed 60 pounds. The ocean swims were longer, the water colder, and the instructors were giving them less time to recover between sessions. Derek was still performing near the top in raw physical tests, but the gap between him and the other recruits was closing. Some of the men and women he had dismissed in the first week were now keeping up with him, even passing him on certain exercises. This bothered Derek more than he would ever admit. He started training alone in the evenings, doing extra sets of pull-ups and push-ups in the corner of the barracks while everyone else rested. He was trying to maintain his edge, trying to stay ahead, because being ahead was the only thing that gave him his identity. Mara, meanwhile, had quietly moved up in the rankings without anyone really noticing. She was not trying to be first. She was not trying to prove anything. She was simply doing what she had always done, performing steadily, efficiently, and without wasted energy. Her body knew these exercises the way a musician's fingers know the keys of a piano. She had done all of this before, years ago, and she had done it under conditions far worse than what these recruits were experiencing. The other recruits had started to notice something about Mara, even if they could not quite put it into words. There was something about the way she moved, something about the way she handled pressure, that was different from everyone else. She never panicked. She never complained. She never asked for rest or extra water or time. She just did what needed to be done, and she did it with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural in a place designed to create chaos. Ellis had become something of a friend to Mara during the long evenings after training. They would sit together in the common area, not talking much, just sharing the quiet companionship that develops between people who are going through the same fire. Ellis was smart enough to know that Mara was not an ordinary recruit, but he was also wise enough not to ask questions she clearly did not want to answer. He respected her privacy and her silence, and she respected his integrity and his kindness. One night, Ellis asked Mara why she never reacted to the things Derek said about her. He had heard some of the comments, and they were getting worse. Derek had started calling her the passenger behind her back, implying that she was just along for the ride while the real warriors did the heavy lifting. Ellis said he would have confronted Derek a long time ago if someone had been talking about him that way. Mara looked at Ellis for a long moment, and then she said something that Ellis would remember for the rest of his life. She said that the loudest person in the room is usually the most afraid. She said that Derek was not attacking her because she was weak. He was attacking her because something about her made him feel unsure about himself, and he did not know how to handle that feeling except by trying to tear her down. She said that responding to someone like Derek with anger was like throwing gasoline on a fire. It only made the destruction bigger. Ellis thought about this and nodded slowly. He asked her if she had ever met someone like Derek before. Mara smiled, just barely, and said she had met many. She said some of them learned. She said some of them did not. She said the ones who did not learn usually ended up paying a price that was far higher than they ever imagined. Ellis wanted to ask what she meant by that, but something in her eyes told him the conversation was over. He went to his bunk and lay there in the dark, thinking about what she had said, and wondering what exactly Mara Voss was hiding beneath that calm, quiet surface. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and pain. The instructors introduced a new series of exercises that required teams to work together in ways that were far more complex than anything they had done before. There were tactical simulations, problem-solving challenges under extreme stress, and leadership rotations where different recruits were put in charge of the group and evaluated on how they handled the responsibility. When it was Derek's turn to lead, the results were predictable. He barked orders like a drill sergeant. He did not listen to suggestions from his team. He made decisions based on what he thought would make him look good, rather than what was best for the group. When the exercise went badly, which it did, he blamed his team members instead of examining his own choices. The instructors recorded everything. Mara recorded everything. When it was Mara's turn to lead, something interesting happened. She gathered her team together before the exercise started and asked each person what they thought the best approach was. She listened to every answer. She combined the best ideas into a simple, clear plan. She assigned roles based on each person's strengths. She gave encouragement instead of criticism. And when the exercise was finished, her team had completed it faster and more efficiently than any other team that week. Derek watched this from across the field, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tight. He could not understand how she had done it. He could not understand how a team led by someone who was quiet and small and unimposing could outperform a team led by someone who was loud and strong and commanding. It did not fit the story he had been telling himself his entire life, and instead of questioning the story, he questioned her. He started telling anyone who would listen that Mara had gotten lucky. He said, "The exercise was designed for people who liked to talk instead of act." He said that in a real combat situation, her approach would get everyone killed. He said this with such conviction that a few recruits actually believed him, at least for a while, but most of them did not believe him anymore. Most of them had seen enough to know that Derek's version of strength was not the only version, and it might not even be the best. One, they had seen Mara lead. They had seen her stay calm when everyone else was falling apart. They had seen her help others without being asked, and succeed without making it about herself. And they were starting to realize that maybe the quiet woman in the middle of the pack was something much more than she appeared to be. The tension between Derek and Mara was building like pressure inside a sealed container. Everyone could feel it. The instructors could feel it. The other recruits could feel it. Even the air itself seemed to grow heavier whenever Derek and Mara were in the same space. Something was going to happen. Everyone knew it. The only question was when, and where, and how bad it was going to be. That answer was now only days away, and it was going to arrive in the most ordinary of places, at the most ordinary of times, in a way that would leave every single person who witnessed it stunned into silence. The mess hall was waiting. Tuesday evening was approaching, and Derek Holt was walking straight toward the biggest mistake of his entire life. Tuesday arrived with the same brutal routine that had defined every day since the recruits stepped foot on the base. The morning began at 4:30 with an ice-cold ocean swim that lasted 45 minutes. The water was so cold that 2 recruits had to be pulled out when their bodies started shutting down. One of them rang the bell that afternoon. The other one stayed, shivering and silent, wrapped in a blanket in the medical tent, determined not to give up, even though his body was begging him to. Derek came out of the water with a scowl on his face and fire in his muscles. The cold had not broken him physically, but something inside him was starting to crack. He had noticed that his body was not recovering as fast as it used to. The constant punishment of the training was wearing him down in ways he had never experienced before. His shoulders ached in a deep, grinding way. His knees felt like they had sand inside them. His hands were raw and blistered from the ropes and the logs and the sand. He was tired in a way that went beyond anything physical. He was tired in his bones, in his spirit, in the deepest parts of himself. But he would never admit this, not to anyone, not even to himself. Admitting weakness was the same as being weak in Derek's mind, and being weak was the one thing he could not allow himself to be, so he pushed harder. He yelled louder. He trained more aggressively. He built higher walls around himself and told himself that the pain was just his body being purified, being forged into something unbreakable. The morning continued with a 3-mile run in soft sand carrying a telephone pole above their heads in teams of 6. Derek's team finished second. The team that finished first was led by a recruit named Dawson, a quiet, wiry man from Oregon who had somehow figured out the perfect rhythm for keeping the pole balanced while moving at speed. Derek hated Dawson for this small victory. He hated anyone who beat him at anything, no matter how small. After the run came a series of obstacle course repetitions that left everyone gasping. Then came classroom instruction on land navigation and tactical communication, during which Derek sat in the back and barely paid attention. He thought the classroom sessions were a waste of time. He thought real warriors learned by doing, not by sitting in chairs listening to lectures. He did not realize that the information being taught in those sessions could one day mean the difference between a successful mission and a body bag. Mara sat in the front row during the classroom sessions. She took notes even though she already knew everything being taught. She asked questions that made the instructors pause and think. She engaged with the material in a way that showed genuine curiosity and respect for the knowledge being shared. The other recruits noticed this. Some of them started sitting closer to her during the lectures, hoping to learn from her questions and her approach. By the time the afternoon training sessions were over, everyone was destroyed. The kind of destroyed where your legs feel like they are made of wet clay and your arms refuse to lift above your waist. The kind of destroyed where even breathing feels like work. The recruits shuffled toward the mess hall like a line of broken machines, their bodies moving on autopilot, their minds numb with exhaustion. The mess hall at Coronado was a large plain building with long metal tables and hard plastic chairs. The food was simple but plentiful, designed to refuel bodies that had been pushed to their absolute limits. There was always protein, always carbohydrates, always vegetables. The portions were generous because the calories were needed. Eating was not a luxury during SEAL training. It was a necessity, a survival tool, as important as any weapon or piece of equipment. Derek walked into the mess hall that Tuesday evening with his tray in his hands and his usual expression of irritated superiority on his face. He loaded his tray with double portions of everything. He grabbed 2 bread rolls and 3 cartons of milk. He moved through the line aggressively, reaching over other recruits, cutting in front of people who were too tired to protest. He was hungry and impatient, and in no mood to wait for anyone. The mess hall was crowded. Almost every seat was taken. The remaining recruits, along with a number of permanent staff and instructors, filled the tables. The noise level was moderate, a low hum of tired voices and the clink of utensils on trays. It was the most relaxed part of the day, the 1 hour when the recruits could sit down, eat, and feel almost human again. Derek found a seat at the end of a long table and dropped his tray down with a loud clatter. The recruits sitting nearby glanced at him and then looked away. Nobody wanted to sit near Derek anymore. His presence had become something people endured rather than enjoyed. The chair next to him was empty, and the chair across from him was empty, and this did not bother him because he told himself he preferred it that way. Mara came into the mess hall about 10 minutes after Derek. She had stayed behind to help a recruit named Torres, who had twisted her ankle during the last exercise and needed help wrapping it before she could walk. Mara had done this quietly, without being asked, the way she did everything. She walked through the food line, took a normal portion of chicken, rice, and vegetables, grabbed a bottle of water, and looked for a place to sit. The only open seats in her section of the mess hall were at the same table where Derek was sitting. She walked over without hesitation and sat down 2 chairs away from him. She placed her tray on the table, arranged her utensils, and began to eat in silence. Derek noticed her immediately. He always noticed her, even though he pretended not to. Her presence bothered him in a way he could not explain. There was something about the way she carried herself, something about her refusal to be intimidated, something about her quiet competence that got under his skin like a splinter he could not reach. Every time he saw her, he felt a tiny flicker of doubt inside himself, and he hated that feeling more than anything else in the world. For a few minutes, nothing happened. They ate in silence, 2 chairs apart, surrounded by the noise and movement of the mess hall. Other recruits came and went. Conversations buzzed around them. Everything was normal. Then Derek reached across the table for the salt shaker, at the same moment that Mara reached for her water bottle. Their arms crossed in the air, and Derek's elbow knocked Mara's water bottle off the table. It hit the floor with a hollow plastic thud and rolled under the bench. It was an accident, the kind of tiny, meaningless collision that happens 1,000 times a day in crowded spaces. Any reasonable person would have said sorry and moved on. Any decent person would have picked up the bottle and handed it back. But Derek was not feeling reasonable, and he had stopped being decent a long time ago. He looked at Mara and said nothing. He did not apologize. He did not pick up the bottle. He just stared at her with a flat, cold expression and then went back to eating his food, as if she did not exist, as if her presence was so far beneath his notice that even acknowledging the accident would be a waste of his time. Mara looked at him for a moment. Then she calmly leaned down, picked up the water bottle, wiped it off with her napkin, and placed it back on the table. She did not say anything either. She did not need to. She had dealt with far worse than a rude man who could not be bothered to say sorry. But something about her calmness, her absolute refusal to react, seemed to infuriate Derek even more. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to get angry, or to look hurt, or to complain. He wanted her to give him a reason to feel justified in his contempt. Her silence denied him that satisfaction, and the denial made the anger inside him grow hotter. A few minutes passed. Derek finished his first plate and got up to get more food. When he came back, he sat down harder than necessary, making the bench shake. His tray banged against the table. A few pieces of corn rolled off his plate and onto the surface between them. One piece rolled all the way to Mara's tray and stopped against the edge of her plate. She picked it up with 2 fingers and placed it on the side of his tray without looking at him. Something about this small, simple gesture broke something inside Derek. Maybe it was the casualness of it. Maybe it was the way she did it without any apparent emotion, like she was dealing with a child who had made a mess. Maybe it was the fact that several other recruits at the table had seen it happen and were now watching the interaction with barely hidden interest. Whatever the reason, Derek felt a rush of heat flood his face and his neck. His hands tightened around his fork. His jaw locked. He turned to Mara and said, loud enough for the people around them to hear, that she should keep her hands off his food. He said it with a tone that was meant to intimidate, the kind of voice he used back in Texas when he wanted someone to back down at a bar. Mara looked at him. She did not flinch. She did not lean back. She looked at him the way a doctor looks at a patient who is showing symptoms of something predictable. She said in a voice that was calm and even that she was just returning what was his. Derek's face got redder. He said she should mind her own business, he said. She should focus on not getting washed out of the program instead of touching other people's stuff. He said this with a sneer that twisted his face into something ugly. The recruits around them had stopped eating. They were watching now, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths, their eyes darting between Derek and Mara like spectators at a match they had been expecting but hoping would never happen. Mara said nothing more. She turned back to her food and continued eating. Her hand was steady. Her breathing was normal. There was not a single visible sign of stress or fear on her body. She had faced men pointing weapons at her. She had been in rooms where a wrong word meant death. A loud recruit in a mess hall did not even register on her scale of threats. But her lack of reaction was like oxygen feeding a fire that was already burning, out of control inside Derek. He sat there for another minute, staring at the side of her face, his mind spinning with anger and resentment, and something else, something deeper, something that felt dangerously like fear. He was afraid that she was not intimidated by him. He was afraid that her calm was real, not an act. He was afraid that she saw through him in a way that nobody else had ever managed to do. And that fear, twisted and compressed by his ego, transformed into the worst possible impulse. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sharp sound that cut through the noise of the mess hall. People at nearby tables turned to look. Derek stood over Mara, his shadow falling across her tray, his fists clenched at his sides. He said she needed to show some respect. He said she had been acting like she was better than everyone since the first day. He said he was tired of her attitude, tired of her silence, tired of the way she looked at him like he was nothing. His voice was rising with each sentence, getting louder, getting harder, getting closer to the edge of something that could not be taken back. Mara put down her fork slowly. She looked up at him from her seated position, and for the first time, Derek saw something in her eyes that he did not understand. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something colder and more controlled than either of those things. It was the look of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome of this moment and was completely prepared for all of them. She said in a voice that was quiet but carried through the silence that had fallen over the mess hall that he should sit down and finish his dinner. That was it. That was all she said. Sit down and finish your dinner. 7 words. But the way she said them, with an authority that came not from volume, but from absolute certainty, made Derek feel like a child being scolded by a parent. And that feeling, in front of all those people, in front of the recruits he wanted to impress and dominate, was more than his ego could bear. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Derek pulled his right arm back and threw a punch directly at Mara's face. It was fast and hard, and aimed with the kind of precision that comes from years of fighting. It was the kind of punch that had knocked out men twice Mara's size in parking lots and bars back in Texas. It was the kind of punch that Derek believed would end any confrontation instantly and permanently. It never landed. Mara moved with a speed that did not seem possible for someone who had been sitting still a moment before. Her body shifted to the left, and Derek's fist passed through the space where her head had been half a second earlier. Before his arm had even completed its forward motion, Mara was already off the bench and on her feet. Her movement was fluid, practiced, the product of thousands of hours of close-quarters combat training that Derek could not even imagine. In the same motion, she caught his extended wrist with her left hand, rotated it outward in a way that hyperextended his elbow and sent a bolt of electric pain shooting up his arm. Her right hand came up and pressed firmly against his chest, not punching, not striking, just pressing with a controlled force that redirected his momentum and sent him stumbling backward. He tripped over the bench and went down hard on his back, his tray clattering to the floor beside him, food scattering across the tile. The entire mess hall went silent. Not the gradual kind of silence where conversations taper off one by one. This was instant, total silence. The kind of silence that happens when every person in a room witnesses something that their brains need a moment to process. Forks stopped moving. Mouths stopped chewing. Every single pair of eyes in that room was locked on the scene at the end of the long table. Derek lay on the floor, stunned. The pain in his elbow was sharp and pulsing. The back of his head throbbed from where it had hit the tile. But worse than any physical pain was the shock, the absolute incomprehensible shock of what had just happened. He had thrown his best punch at a woman half his size, and she had not only avoided it, but had put him on the ground without even hitting him back. She had redirected his own strength against him like it was nothing, like he was nothing. He looked up at Mara from the floor, and for the first time, he saw her clearly. She was standing above him in a balanced, relaxed stance that was neither aggressive nor defensive. Her breathing was completely normal. Her expression had not changed. She looked exactly the same as she had 5 seconds ago, when she had been sitting quietly eating her dinner. There was no adrenaline in her face, no excitement, no anger, just that same calm, measured presence that had confused him from the very first day. The recruits around them were frozen in place. Some had their hands over their mouths. Some were gripping the edges of the table. Ellis was on his feet across the room, his face a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like admiration. Torres, the recruit with the twisted ankle that Mara had helped earlier, was standing near the food line with tears in her eyes, though whether they were from fear or from something else was impossible to tell. Derek's mind was racing. He wanted to get up and attack her again. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to get up, to fight, to prove that what had just happened was a fluke. But something kept him on the ground. Something in the way Mara was looking down at him told him that getting up would be a very, very bad idea. It was the same instinct that tells a prey animal to stay still when a predator is watching. Some part of Derek's brain, the old primitive part that existed before ego and pride, recognized that he was in the presence of something genuinely dangerous, and it told him to stay where he was. The silence lasted for what felt like an eternity but was probably only about 10 seconds. Then a voice cut through the quiet, a deep, commanding voice that everyone in the room recognized immediately. It was Chief Warrant Officer Braden. He had been sitting at a table near the entrance, and he had seen everything. He walked toward them with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who was absolutely furious, but had complete control over his fury. He stopped next to Mara and looked down at Derek on the floor. Then he looked at Mara. Then he looked back at Derek. His face was a mask of disciplined rage. He told Derek to get up. Derek got to his feet slowly. his legs unsteady, his face burning with humiliation. He could not look at Mara. He could not look at anyone. He stared at a spot on the floor and tried to disappear inside himself. Chief Braden asked Derek if he understood what he had just done. Derek said nothing. Chief Braden asked him again, louder this time, if he understood the gravity of what had just happened. Derek mumbled something about her provoking him. Chief Braden took a step closer to Derek, so close that their faces were inches apart, and said that nobody had provoked anyone. He said that the entire mess hall had seen exactly what happened. He said that Derek had thrown a punch at a fellow service member during a meal, unprovoked, and that this was not just a violation of training protocol, but a potential criminal offense under military law. Derek's face drained of color. The reality of what he had done was starting to penetrate the fog of his anger. He had assaulted someone in a military facility, in front of dozens of witnesses. The consequences of this were not going to be push-ups and extra running. The consequences of this could end his career before it had even started. But Chief Braden was not finished. He turned to Mara and said, loud enough for the entire mess hall to hear, that he wanted to make sure everyone in the room understood exactly who Derek had just tried to hit.
He said that the woman standing in front of them was not a recruit.
He said that her name was Lieutenant Commander Mara Voss. He said that she was a 12-year veteran of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. He said that she had completed more combat deployments than most people in the room would complete in their entire careers. He said that she had earned a Silver Star for valor and 2 Bronze Stars for heroism in combat. He said that she was one of the most decorated operators in the history of the command. He paused to let this sink in, and the silence that followed was different from the silence before. This was the silence of 30 people simultaneously realizing that the world was not what they thought it was. This was the silence of understanding crashing into assumption like a wave against a rock. Derek's eyes went wide. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked at Mara, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw not a small, quiet woman who did not belong. He saw a warrior who had chosen to be quiet, who had chosen to be small, who had chosen to let people like him underestimate her, because that was the most powerful position of all. He felt his knees go weak, not from the fall, not from the pain in his elbow, but from the crushing weight of his own stupidity falling on him all at once. He had spent weeks mocking this woman. He had called her weak. He had called her a passenger. He had said she belonged in a yoga class. And the whole time, every single second, she had been something so far beyond him that the distance was almost laughable. Chief Braden ordered Derek to report to the commanding officer's quarters immediately. He told 2 other instructors to escort him. He told the rest of the recruits to finish their meals and return to their barracks. He told them that what they had witnessed tonight was a lesson, and he hoped they were smart enough to learn from it. As Derek was led out of the mess hall, flanked by 2 stone-faced instructors, he passed within 3 feet of Mara. She was already sitting back down at the table, picking up her fork, preparing to finish her meal as if nothing had happened. She did not look at him as he passed. She did not gloat. She did not smirk. She simply returned to her dinner with the same calm that had defined her from the very beginning. But as Derek passed her, she said one thing. She said it quietly, so quietly that only he could hear it. She said that she hoped he would learn from this. Derek did not respond. He could not respond. His throat was closed, his eyes were stinging, and every belief he had ever held about himself was crumbling like a building made of sand. He walked out of the mess hall and into the night air, and the cool breeze hit his face like a slap, and for the first time in his life, Derek Holt had absolutely no idea who he was. Back inside the mess hall, the recruits sat in stunned silence for a long time. Then, slowly, like a machine restarting after a power failure, the conversations began again. But they were different now. They were quieter, more thoughtful, more careful. People were looking at Mara with new eyes, with a respect that went far beyond anything physical. Ellis walked over to Mara's table and sat down across from her. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said he had always known there was something different about her. Mara looked at him and raised an eyebrow. And something about the expression made Ellis laugh, a short, disbelieving laugh that released some of the tension that had been building in his chest. He asked her why she had not just told everyone who she was from the beginning, why she had let Derek treat her that way for weeks without saying a word. why she had allowed herself to be mocked and belittled by someone who was not worthy of carrying her boots. Mara thought about this for a moment, and then she said that titles and medals did not prove anything. She said that a person's character was revealed by how they behaved when they thought nobody important was watching. She said that if she had walked in wearing her rank and her awards, she would have learned nothing about any of them, and they would have learned nothing about themselves. Ellis considered this. He said it made sense. Then he asked with a small smile if she had been tempted at any point during the last 3 weeks to tell Derek exactly who he was dealing with. Mara allowed herself a small smile, too. She said she had been tempted exactly once, on the 3rd day, when Derek had called her a passenger within earshot of 2 other recruits. She said the temptation had lasted about half a second, and then she had remembered why she was there, and the temptation had vanished. Ellis shook his head in admiration. He said he did not know how she did it. Mara said that self-control was a muscle, just like any other. She said you had to train it every day, and eventually it became so strong that nothing could break it. She said the people who mastered self-control were the ones who survived, not just in combat, but in life. The mess hall slowly emptied as recruits finished their meals and headed back to the barracks. The energy on the base that night was different from any night before. It was the energy of a group of people who had just had their assumptions shattered, who had been forced to see the world differently, and who were now trying to figure out what that meant for them and for the people around them. In the barracks, the recruits talked in low voices about what had happened. They talked about Derek and Mara and the punch that never landed. They talked about how fast Mara had moved, how effortless it had seemed, how she had put a man twice her size on the ground without even throwing a punch of her own. They talked about her medals and her deployments, and the things Chief Braden had said about her record, and they talked about the lesson the one Chief Braden had told them to learn. Some of them got it immediately. They understood that strength came in many forms, that the loudest person was not always the strongest, that true warriors did not need to prove themselves because their actions spoke for them. They understood that judging someone by their appearance or their volume was not just foolish but dangerous. Others took longer to process what they had seen. They had spent their whole lives believing the same things Derek believed, that size and aggression were all that mattered, that dominance was the same as leadership, that vulnerability was weakness. Unlearning these beliefs was not going to happen in one night. It was going to take time and experience and probably a few more failures before the lesson truly sank in. But all of them, without exception, went to sleep that night with a new understanding of what it meant to be truly strong. And all of them, without exception, had a new level of respect for the quiet woman who had walked among them for 3 weeks without anyone knowing who she really was. Meanwhile, in the commanding officer's quarters, Derek Holt was sitting in a hard metal chair, staring at the wall, waiting to learn what the consequences of his actions would be. His elbow was still throbbing, his back was still sore from the fall, but these physical pains were nothing compared to the storm that was raging inside his mind. He kept replaying the moment in his head, over and over. The punch, the miss, the floor, the silence. Chief Braden's voice revealing who Mara was, the look on everyone's faces, the walk of shame out of the mess hall. Each replay was more painful than the last, because each time he saw it more clearly, and each time the truth about himself became harder to deny. He had been a fool. Not just tonight, but for weeks, for years, for his entire life. He had built his identity on a foundation of arrogance and aggression, and that foundation had just collapsed underneath him in front of everyone who mattered. He had mocked a hero. He had dismissed a warrior. He had tried to hurt someone who had done nothing but help others, and he had been stopped as easily as a child being caught by a parent. The commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, entered the room at 9:30 that evening. He was a tall, thin man with gray hair and glasses that made him look more like a professor than a military officer. But his eyes were sharp, and his voice carried the weight of 30 years of service. He sat down across from Derek and studied him for a long time without speaking. Then Captain Reynolds asked Derek to tell him what happened. Derek started with the mess hall, with the water bottle and the corn and the argument. Captain Reynolds stopped him and said he did not mean tonight. He meant everything. He meant why Derek was here, what he was trying to prove, what he was running from. He said that men did not throw punches at strangers over nothing, unless there was something much bigger happening underneath the surface. Derek sat in that hard chair and felt something crack open inside him. It was the crack that had been forming for weeks, the one he had been ignoring and covering with muscle and attitude and noise. And through that crack, something honest began to seep out for the first time in a very long time. But what he said to Captain Reynolds, and what happened in the days that followed, would determine whether that crack would heal into something stronger or shatter into something beyond repair. And the answer to that question was not going to come from Derek alone. It was going to come in part from the last person he ever expected to give him a second chance. Captain Reynolds sat across from Derek for 2 hours that night. He did not yell, he did not lecture. He asked questions, and then he listened, and something about the way he listened, patient, focused, without judgment, made Derek talk in ways he had never talked before. The words came out slowly at first, like water through a cracked pipe, and then faster, until they were pouring out of him in a flood he could not stop. Derek told Captain Reynolds about his father. He told him about growing up in a house where strength was the only currency that mattered. He told him about his father's rules, which were not really rules but commandments carved into the walls of their home by years of repetition. Never show weakness. Never back down. Never let anyone see you hurt. Hit first and hit hard. Apologizing is for people who have already lost. He told the captain about the time he came home from school in the 4th grade with a black eye. He had been in a fight with an older boy on the playground, and he had lost. His father had looked at the bruise under Derek's eye and had not asked if he was okay. He had not comforted him. He had taken Derek into the backyard and made him hit a punching bag for an hour, telling him that next time he needed to win. Derek was 9 years old. His hands bled through the tape, and his father told him the blood was good. He said blood meant he was learning. He told Captain Reynolds about his older brother, Kyle, who had joined the Marines and come back from Afghanistan a different person. Kyle did not talk about what he had seen overseas. He drank instead. He sat in dark rooms and stared at walls. He flinched at loud sounds and sometimes woke up screaming in the middle of the night. Their father called Kyle weak. He said the war had broken him, and real men did not break. Derek watched his brother disappear into himself, and he swore he would never be like Kyle. He would never break. He would never be called weak by their father or by anyone else. So Derek built himself into something that could not be broken, or so he thought. He built his body into armor. He built his attitude into a weapon. He learned to attack before he could be attacked, to dominate before he could be dominated, to control every room he entered through sheer force of personality and physical presence. It worked in high school. It worked in the bars. It worked in the gym. It worked everywhere he went until he came here, to this place where the rules were different, where the definition of strength was different, where a quiet woman with no visible muscles could put him on the floor without breaking a sweat. Captain Reynolds listened to all of this without interrupting. When Derek was finished, the captain was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that hit Derek harder than any punch he had ever received. He said that Derek's father had done him a terrible disservice. He said that the version of manhood Derek had been taught was a lie, a broken, incomplete, destructive lie that had already cost Derek more than he realized, and would cost him everything if he did not find the courage to reject it. He said that real strength was not about hitting the hardest or being the loudest or refusing to show emotion. Real strength was about knowing when to fight and when not to fight. It was about protecting people who could not protect themselves. It was about admitting when you were wrong and having the guts to change. It was about carrying pain without passing it on to others. It was about being soft when softness was needed and hard when hardness was needed and having the wisdom to know the difference. He said that Lieutenant Commander Voss was one of the strongest human beings he had ever known. And the reason she was strong had nothing to do with how fast she could move or how many missions she had completed. She was strong because she had mastered herself. She controlled her emotions instead of being controlled by them. She led through example instead of intimidation. She made everyone around her better instead of tearing them down. That, Captain Reynolds said, was what strength looked like when it grew up. Derek sat in that chair and felt the tears come. He tried to stop them because his father's voice was still in his head telling him that tears were weakness, telling him that real men did not cry. But the tears came anyway, falling silently down his face, and for the first time in his life he did not fight them. He let them fall. He let himself feel the weight of everything he had been carrying, the anger, and the fear, and the loneliness, and the deep aching sadness of a boy who had been taught that the only way to be loved was to be dangerous. Captain Reynolds did not hand him a tissue. He did not tell him it was okay. He just sat there and let Derek feel what he was feeling, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is simply be present while they fall apart. When the tears stopped, Captain Reynolds told Derek what was going to happen next. He said that Derek's actions in the mess hall constituted assault on a superior officer, which was a serious criminal offense under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He said that the normal consequence for this would be immediate discharge from the program, possible criminal charges, and a permanent mark on his military record that would follow him for the rest of his life. Derek's stomach dropped. He had known the consequences would be bad, but hearing them spoken out loud made them terrifyingly real. His career was over. Everything he had worked for, all the training, all the sacrifice, all the dreams of wearing the trident, it was all gone. He had destroyed it himself with his own fist in less than 2 seconds. But Captain Reynolds was not finished. He said that the decision about Derek's future was not entirely his to make. He said that Lieutenant Commander Voss had the right, as the assaulted officer, to weigh in on what should happen. He said that Voss had already been asked for her recommendation, and her answer had surprised everyone. Derek looked up from the floor. His eyes were red and swollen. His face was a mess of tears and confusion. He asked what she had said. Captain Reynolds told him that Lieutenant Commander Voss had recommended that Derek not be discharged. She had recommended that he be given one more chance under strict conditions to continue his training and prove that he could change. She had said that she believed the incident in the mess hall was not a reflection of who Derek truly was, but a reflection of who Derek had been taught to be, and that with the right guidance he could learn to be someone better. Derek was stunned. He could not understand it. He had spent weeks mocking this woman, belittling her, disrespecting her in front of everyone. He had thrown a punch at her face, and now she was asking them to give him another chance. It did not make sense. It went against everything he had ever been taught about how the world worked. In his world, if someone attacked you, you destroyed them. You did not offer them mercy. You did not believe in their potential. You crushed them and moved on. But Mara Voss did not live in Derek's world. She lived in a different one, a world where strength and compassion were not opposites but partners, a world where the measure of a warrior was not how many enemies they defeated but how many people they lifted up, a world where giving someone a second chance required more courage than throwing a punch. Captain Reynolds told Derek that the conditions of his second chance were strict and non-negotiable. He would be placed on formal probation for the remainder of the training program. He would be required to attend daily counseling sessions with the base psychologist. He would be required to write a formal apology to Lieutenant Commander Voss. He would be removed from all leadership exercises for the next 2 weeks, and he would be required to perform any additional duties that the instructors assigned to him without complaint. Most importantly, Captain Reynolds said, Derek would be required to understand, truly understand, why what he did was wrong, not just the punch. Everything. The weeks of disrespect, the mocking, the arrogance, the belief that he was better than everyone around him simply because he was bigger and louder. If Derek could not demonstrate a genuine change in his character and his behavior, he would be removed from the program permanently, and this time, there would be no second chance. Derek agreed to everything. He did not hesitate. He did not argue. For the first time in his life, he simply said yes and meant it. He was escorted back to the barracks shortly before midnight. The other recruits were in their bunks, most of them still awake, the events of the evening still buzzing in their minds. When Derek walked through the door, every eye turned to him. Some looked at him with anger. Some looked at him with pity. Some looked at him with the cold satisfaction of seeing a bully brought low. Nobody spoke to him. He walked to his bunk, sat down, and stared at his hands in the darkness for a long time before lying down and closing his eyes. He did not sleep that night. He lay in his bunk and listened to the sounds of the barracks, the breathing of the other recruits, the distant crash of waves on the beach, the hum of the air conditioning. He thought about his father and his brother and his mother, who had died when he was 12 and whose absence had left a hole in his life that he had been trying to fill with muscle and anger ever since. He thought about all the people he had hurt, not just Mara, but everyone, the recruits he had belittled, the friends he had pushed away, the women he had been cruel to, the long, ugly trail of destruction that his ego had left behind him everywhere he went. And for the first time, he did not make excuses. He did not blame anyone else. He did not tell himself that the world was unfair, or that people were too soft, or that he was being persecuted for being strong. He simply sat with the truth and let it sit with him, heavy and uncomfortable and necessary. The next morning, Derek reported to the counseling office at 6 o'clock, 30 minutes before the rest of the class began their morning routine. The base psychologist was a woman named Dr. Adler, a civilian contractor with 20 years of experience working with military personnel. She was in her 50s, with short gray hair and glasses, and a quiet manner that reminded Derek, uncomfortably, of Mara. Their first session was awkward and stilted. Derek did not know how to talk about his feelings because he had never been allowed to have them. Adler was patient. She did not push. She asked open-ended questions and let Derek take as long as he needed to find the answers. She told him that therapy was not a punishment. It was a tool, the same way a weapon or a compass was a tool. It was something that could help him navigate the terrain of his own mind, which was the most dangerous terrain of all. Over the next several days, Derek began to open up. He talked about his childhood. He talked about his father. He talked about Kyle. He talked about the fear that had been living inside him for as long as he could remember. The fear of being seen as weak. The fear of being vulnerable. The fear of being alone. Dr. Adler helped him see that these fears were not weaknesses. They were wounds, old and deep, and they needed to be treated with the same care and attention as any physical injury. She also helped him understand something about Mara that he had not been able to figure out on his own. She asked him why he thought Mara had bothered him so much. Why, out of all the recruits in the class, she was the one who got under his skin. Derek thought about it and said he did not know. Dr. Adler suggested that maybe Mara represented something Derek was afraid of, a version of strength that did not require aggression, a version of power that did not need to be loud. She suggested that seeing Mara succeed quietly and calmly threatened the foundation of everything Derek believed about himself, and instead of questioning those beliefs, he had attacked the person who made him question them. This insight hit Derek like a thunderbolt. It was so obvious once she said it, so painfully clear, that he could not believe he had not seen it himself. He had not been angry at Mara. He had been angry at the part of himself that knew she was right and he was wrong. He had been angry at the truth, and he had tried to punch it in the face. Meanwhile, Mara continued her duties on the base. She had resumed her role as an observer, though now everyone knew who she was, and the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Recruits who had barely noticed her before now approached her with questions, seeking her advice on everything from combat techniques to mental resilience to career decisions. She answered every question with the same patience and thoughtfulness that she brought to everything she did. She did not avoid Derek, but she did not seek him out either. She treated him the same way she treated everyone else, with professional courtesy and a baseline of respect. She did not hold what had happened against him, at least not visibly. When they crossed paths during training, she nodded to him the way she nodded to everyone. She did not make a show of forgiving him. She simply moved forward the way she always did. About 5 days after the incident, Derek sat down at his bunk after a particularly brutal training session and began writing the apology letter that Captain Reynolds had required. He had been thinking about it for days, trying to find the right words, the words that would convey the depth of his regret without sounding hollow or rehearsed. He went through 7 drafts before he had something he was willing to show anyone. The letter was 3 pages long. In it, Derek apologized, not just for the punch, but for every disrespectful comment, every mocking remark, every dismissive look he had directed at Mara during his time on the base. He admitted that he had judged her based on her appearance and his own narrow definition of strength, and that he had been wrong. He admitted that he had been carrying a lifetime of bad lessons and broken beliefs, and that he was trying to unlearn them, though he knew the process would take far longer than a few weeks. He wrote that he did not expect her forgiveness. He wrote that he did not deserve it. He wrote that all he could do was promise to be better, and to spend the rest of his time in the program, and the rest of his career, trying to live up to the standard she had set by giving him a second chance he had not earned. He delivered the letter to Mara the next morning, standing in front of her with his hands shaking and his voice cracking. Mara took the letter, looked at him, and said she would read it. Then she said something that Derek would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said that the hardest fight anyone ever faces is the fight against who they used to be. She said that winning that fight is the only victory that truly matters. Derek nodded. He could not speak. He turned and walked away, and he did not look back, because he was afraid she would see the tears that were forming in his eyes again. But this time, the tears did not feel like weakness. They felt like something else. They felt like the beginning of something new. The remaining weeks of initial training were transformed for Derek. He was not the same person who had walked through the gates of Coronado with his chest puffed out and his ego leading the way. He was quieter now. He listened more. He helped other recruits without being asked. He stopped trying to be the best at everything and started trying to be useful. He stopped measuring himself against others and started measuring himself against who he had been the day before. It was not easy. Old habits fought back every single day. There were moments when the old Derek tried to resurface, when the urge to dominate and control and prove himself threatened to overwhelm the new habits he was building. But each time this happened, he remembered the mess hall. He remembered the floor. He remembered the sound of silence after he went down. And the memory pulled him back from the edge every time. The other recruits noticed the change. At first, they were skeptical. They thought it was an act, a performance designed to keep him in the program. But as the days turned into weeks, the skepticism faded. They saw Derek carrying extra gear for a recruit who was injured. They saw him staying late to help clean the barracks. They saw him sitting in the common area reading a book about emotional intelligence that Dr. Adler had recommended. They saw him apologize to Parker, the 19-year-old recruit he had screamed at during the first week, with genuine remorse in his voice and his eyes. Parker accepted the apology. He told Derek that he had been thinking about quitting after that incident, and that the only reason he had stayed was because Mara had found him that night and told him that he had as much right to be there as anyone, and that the people who screamed the loudest were usually the ones who were most afraid of being seen. Parker said that those words had given him the strength to keep going, and that he was grateful to Mara for saying them, and grateful to Derek for finally understanding why they mattered. Ellis became something of a friend to Derek during those final weeks. It was an unlikely friendship between the loud, broken Texan and the quiet, thoughtful New Englander, but it worked because they gave each other something the other needed. Ellis gave Derek patience and perspective. Derek gave Ellis confidence and resilience. They pushed each other during training and talked honestly during the evenings. And slowly a bond formed that was built on mutual respect rather than mutual fear. Mara watched all of this from her position as observer. She wrote notes about Derek's transformation with the same careful attention she had given to his failures. She documented his interactions with other recruits, his performance in team exercises, his behavior during high-stress situations. She noted that he was no longer the first to point blame when things went wrong. She noted that he had started asking for feedback from his teammates instead of assuming he already knew everything. She noted that his physical performance had actually improved because he was no longer wasting energy on anger and ego and was channeling everything into the work itself. On the last day of the initial training phase, the remaining recruits were gathered in the courtyard for a final evaluation. Captain Reynolds stood before them and spoke about what they had accomplished and what lay ahead. He said that the next phase would be harder, that the challenges would multiply, and that many of them would still not make it to the end. But he said that every person standing in that courtyard had earned the right to try, and that was something to be proud of. After the speech, Mara made her way through the group, shaking hands and offering words of encouragement to each recruit. When she reached Derek, she stopped. They stood face to face for the first time since the night of the letter. The other recruits gave them space, sensing that this was a private moment even in a public setting. Derek looked at Mara and said, "Thank you." He said he knew those 2 words were not enough to cover everything he owed her, but they were all he had. He said that she had changed his life, not by beating him or punishing him, but by believing he could be better when he had given her every reason to believe the opposite. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she extended her hand and he took it. Her grip was firm and warm. She said she had not changed his life. She said he had changed it himself. She said the hardest part was over, and the best part was just beginning. She said she expected great things from him, and she meant it. Derek shook her hand and held it a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he let go and stepped back, and Mara moved on to the next recruit, her face calm, her posture relaxed, her presence as steady and grounding as it had been from the very first day. Years later, after Derek had completed his training and earned his trident and deployed on missions that tested every ounce of his body and his spirit, he would tell people about Mara Voss. He would tell them about the mess hall and the punch and the floor. He would tell them about how a quiet woman half his size had knocked him down without throwing a single punch and then picked him up by giving him a chance he